Welcome back to our webinar covering basic concepts involved in offering spiritual companionship to adult survivors of child sexual abuse. This 9th session out of 10 is about healthy boundaries. I'm offering these webinars because I am a survivor of clergy abuse. I'm speaking only from my experience, and you'll find more resources and more information on my website, teresagreen.org, and in my 2 books. Throughout this webinar, we've been talking about a trajectory of hope, this arc of healing that is found in many survivors' lives, not all. And I'll talk now a little bit about that in terms of boundaries. An important aspect of boundaries has to do with the very nature of abuse itself. While people often think of child sexual abuse as sexual in nature, it is for the child violence. It's an intrusion. It's an invasion of personal space. In fact, it's really running roughshod over the boundaries a person has in terms of their ability to choose what their experiences will be. It can be overwhelming. It can be destructive, and in fact it varies from victim to victim based on age, just personal disposition, environment, other factors like how supportive and how much access the individual had to a loving setting otherwise. But the victim in general, the very nature of victimhood is to lose one's boundaries. To become a survivor is to go on with one's adult life, to create relationships, to get your job, to do the things that you would do as any person does as they mature, but also is to struggle with boundaries. The victim doesn't really know ever boundaries before those boundaries were invaded. So essentially, a sense of one's own boundaries is one of the first things that is lost. Also, a sense of other people's boundaries is confusing. And as a survivor, sometimes that's one of the hardest pieces of recovery to grapple with. One way to think of thriving is a kind of spontaneous comfort level with not just other people's boundaries, but one's own boundaries. And that's essentially the arc of recovery in terms of boundaries. In our dialogue, I've been encouraging you to help others integrate their Christian and their Catholic faith in the recovery from child sexual abuse by clergy, but all others too. Boundaries are very much a part of that. We've talked about them throughout the course of the earlier 8 sessions. And the process of healing and reconciling with one's past and also with the people who fail us as children has a lot to do with defining boundaries, where we ended as children and where authority figures began. That becomes very important to understand. For example, we were not at fault. As children, we were not big enough, we were not adult enough to contend with what was being foisted upon us. Boundaries within the sort of 3 themes that I'm looking at during this webinar: the relational boundaries within God's very person, the nature of God as Christians know God, has to do with a sort of fluid boundary, a boundary that is so healthy that one person also can have one God can have 3 persons, distinct and yet so in relationship that they are fluid. And in terms of creativity, that relationship, that spontaneity, comes as we have some slight reflection of that between ourselves and our Creator. We creatures in connection with our Creator, spontaneously, without shame, saved indeed by our Savior, but in this case, in the work we're doing, in your spiritual friendship, helping people realize that that's a relationship that we have offered to us by God. And also in the use of language to express one's boundaries, that's very difficult to learn. But what's important is by your knowing your boundaries, your knowing how to talk about your boundaries, is actually another way a survivor finds a role model, someone to inspire them to express their own and expect to be respected. When it comes to boundaries and your description of your own boundaries, you don't necessarily have to discuss them per se, but it's how you live and how you say things to people, including your ability, for example, to set up a setting that makes the person feel comfortable. You're expressing a respect for their boundaries before they may even know they're there, or indeed before anybody else has ever respected them. Bear in mind, however, as survivors, we're always leery of subtext, especially when we're closer to the victim side of that trajectory, where we're watching for people who are going to turn caring into grooming. And it's very complicated because caring indeed is really being in touch with people's boundaries and caring for the person as they are, whereas we learned grooming was caring for the sake of one's own perverted needs. So it's very important to remember that this can also be confusing at the start. Let's talk about 3 different types of boundaries. The physical we've already talked about quite a bit, so I'll just do a quick look at one screen on that. And emotional boundaries and psychic boundaries. We'll be moving more into really your awareness of your boundaries and how that will in fact prove to be a way for survivors to kind of learn how to expect to be respected for their own. The purpose of this, remember, is always to promote a sense of safety, both in your first meetings and then 5, 6, 7 years in, as you know this person, you need to remember that in times of vulnerability, in surprising times even to ourselves as survivors, these old feelings can creep up, require care, require management, and you don't want to suddenly appear and have an interaction that suddenly re-victimizes us because you've decided suddenly boundaries aren't as needed or as necessary as the past. Also, knowing your own boundaries helps you depersonalize some of the blowback, some of the feedback you get from us as we work through our process and perhaps react to you in ways later that we'll regret. Physical boundaries, I'll just remind you, is being non-threatening physically, knowing how to keep a certain space between you and the other person, being mindful that standing very close to somebody, in fact, can be frightening and actually be aggressive under some circumstances. It's knowing how to keep your voice gentle, quiet, peaceful. It's knowing how to have a firm but brief handshake, and certainly knowing how great big hugs are out, how arms around the shoulders are out, how even touching one's arm or hand gently is out, because that's exactly what the abusers did as they groomed us. They used situations where physicality was certainly innocent to anyone looking at it, but indeed had a subtext. So don't create that setting. Now let's look at emotional boundaries. They're very important. I've got a list of 5 here. There are many others, but these are the things not to do when you're dealing with our emotions and your own in reaction to them. For example, don't judge. You might meet somebody who's got multiple abuse problems, multiple substance abuse problems, maybe has lost all their money, gone through a couple of marriages, maybe is attempted suicide, maybe is just extremely angry and obnoxious. But remember, the best way I tell people to remember this is Christ died for all of us before we were anything but sinners. This person, exactly as they are, is exactly who Jesus wants. This is not to be judged. For all you know, that represents heroic effort compared to what the person has escaped. And it's really important to understand that while we were not respected, surely, as children who were victims, We weren't even really respected by the people who enabled the abusers. But Christ respected us throughout it all. And you, in recreating a relationship and helping us deepen a relationship that already exists, need to live that radical respect. And if you find in your heart that you're judging, you know, and I know, that's your spiritual path. You don't want to be defensive or defend. You may hear that the abuser is an upstanding member of society. Indeed, it could even be clergy. It could even be somebody you know. Your job's not to defend and not to ask for more details. It's simply to affirm that this person in front of you is wounded and that they have a set of emotions and they've got a process and a path ahead of them to pull it all together. Similarly, don't intellectualize. What I'll say is, and I've said this before, the Catholicism has its beautiful tradition of scholasticism, the devotion of mind to the service of God. That's not just intellectual. And yet, speaking from that place, you can drown out and dominate feelings. The sheer logic of really well-honed and mentally healthful intellectualism is really overwhelms feelings, especially when they're first being acknowledged and they're first being kind of sorted out and understood. These are feelings that have been kept under wraps for a very long time. They're going to be much stronger than they will be over time. They're just kind of erupting and they're going to be very confusing. So let them be in the present. Let this person be with their feelings, and remember, your role is to help them understand God will help them feel the feelings, and like a wave, let the feelings pass over time. Similarly, your job's not to solve. Smart as you are, as much as you might have read about this stuff, inspired as you feel in the moment, your goal is simply to accept the person as they are, full of feelings, full of confusing thoughts, possibly with substance problems or other problems. You know, it's really tempting if you're a survivor in a really tough spot to turn to somebody and say, yeah, you know, if you want to help me with all of this, you want to talk to me every single day, you want to, you know, be my pal, sure. But that's just not accepting that this person is responsible for their life. As horrible as it is, and as much as we weren't responsible for what happened to us, we have to sort it through if we are going to heal. And last is not to own this. There are many people and people who've been substance abusers or who've gone through really rough times in their life will know these certain people who almost are drawn like moths to a flame when it comes to other people suffering. But as much as we may even need those people, we can feel them almost using us in a different way. It's important for you to understand that you are a witness, and you're going to be a witness to God helping each of us, each survivor, find their way through recovery to the well life God created us to have. You're going to be a witness to God's glory through suffering. I mean, don't go there when you first talk to people because it makes it sound like there's something great about the suffering, when there's nothing really great about the suffering. What's important is to remember that no one could carry Jesus' cross for him. There is the image of Simon of Cyrene, and when I speak to groups, I often tell people, sure, yeah, you might want to lift the cross off somebody's shoulder now and then. That's okay. But the thing that people seldom focus on is Simon had to return that cross to Jesus. There was the amazing moment when Simon did give Jesus some relief. But what people very seldom cope with is how difficult it is to return the cross fully to the survivor. The secret here is just heart to heart. The secret is you being here to this broken heart. This is what God is looking for. And in this presence to each other, helping the person welcome God even more into their heart And as we know, it will help God into yours more too. Now I'll just talk briefly about psychic. The first one is self-awareness. Really, what are you coming into this trying to make happen is one of the most important things to be aware of. And then also, what is really a fair expectation of what. In terms of self-awareness, there are four things I'd like to underscore briefly. What not to do and what to do. One is to be aware of your need. If somebody walks in with a lot of pain, with a sense that it's all over, that they're going to be crushed by this pain, it's very difficult not to try to take a hand in there and to try to help them. And part of your ministry, assuming that you're a minister or drawn to be a Christian in any way, shape, or form when you listen to this, is to help people. And that's where references and referrals and encouraging people to turn to God and encouraging people not to feel not to lose faith in the ability that they can go through this process. That's great. But your need to recoil from or solve this or lessen this pain is not going to help. That's about you. What the survivor needs to do is sit with that pain and learn how to sit with it and then let it pass by them. The reason you have a lot of substance abusers, a lot of people getting into all sorts of dangerous and toxic situations is as distraction from doing just that, sitting with the pain. So don't be part of the problem. What you want to know is that you can sit there with that pain, pray, or encourage them to pray at the right time. You also want to, yes, know your role. It's a very humbling moment when you realize that on the one hand, to be a person blessed enough to be chosen to help another person, a survivor, get closer to God during this process, that's critical. But there are other critical roles. One is professional psychological help. Other things may be, any number of things, including, for example, biofeedback, yoga, things that help people cope with anxiety. I know some Catholics I know really reject the idea of, for example, yoga, because they rightly point out for some people it's a spiritual, religious way of being. But for a great many people, it is just exercise. And for a lot of people, it's a really important way to cope with what can be debilitating anxiety. Also, whatever you do, don't wing it. Don't feel like, you got it down and you help other people who've got problems. How could this be much different? Don't wing it, because you could hurt someone else and you sure could create problems for yourself. It's important to be knowledgeably sensitive. It's important to understand the issues here. And quite frankly, what you understand here can help you work with people who have mental illness, people who have substance abuse problems and are in programs for recovery, and also can help you with people who've suffered violence in any situation. And last, remember, you're part of a whole system that I've just described. One person isn't going to fix this. No one person can save the survivor. I underscore, even the survivor can't save the survivor. That's the thing that I've never understood when people tell me, especially early in my process, like, get over it, you're holding on to the past. It's like, man, if I could let it go, I sure would. In the end, we all need to be saved. As Christians, we know that's true, and there's only one Savior. And that brings us back to your role in this whole system of support. Which brings us to expectations and what are fair expectations. Now this statement here is really about people who are returning or thinking about returning to the church after having been abused by clergy, or by parents, for example, who were hyper-religious so that the abuse was associated with one's faith, with Catholicism or Christianity. And I say that because, remember, the triggers may be very similar for people whose parents were super religious but were abusers. So it's not always, I'm going to tell you, it's just not always fair to expect people to come back as practicing Catholics. It is sometimes absolutely impossible just mentally in terms of maintaining a stable, well life. Sometimes the best that's going to happen is that a survivor or their family member makes peace with the Catholic Church, but goes forward to find another place to offer worship and to find community. The goal for you is just ever deepening this relationship with God. And I will tell you that as a Catholic who was abused by clergy for over a decade, still, and this is over 30 years into recovery now, still going to Mass can be very, very difficult. And there are still some things that I choose to avoid rather than be triggered. I happen to be able to do that, and I happen to love the faith of my childhood in such a way that I find that it helps me in my life. But I'm not going to pretend that I think all of the survivors of abuse by clergy who I know from my childhood town, for example, could say the same thing. So let's just remind ourselves that there is a role clarity, that you're part of this teamwork, you're part of a patchwork that the survivor will piece together to fit their circumstance. And that your role is a lot about offering a way for the survivor to find trust in God, but that will require of you trust that God will help them, because really you will consistently be finding the very humble reality that you can't. And as we integrate the past with the present, there's a lot of pain. It's why we all avoid it. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having trouble and we wouldn't need your help. And even as you permit us to rely on you in a measure that works both for you and the survivor, ultimately it's about encouraging independence for this person and a sense of confidence that they can put a patchwork together and there can be a network of people available to them. But to underscore at all times that this is a process. It's not going to happen in your office. You're not going to find the magic word that unlocks all of everything. It doesn't happen like it happens in the movies. It's a process, and it's very unique. Your role in spiritual recovery you might want to think of as a listening role, that the listening itself is ministry, that the healing that's going to happen is a process. It's not going to be fast, and it's not going to be linear, that the relationships that this person will reconcile with will be fluid in their boundaries, but need boundaries, so that there will be distinct people. That this person as a creature, as a creation of God, in the closer we draw to our Creator, the more our lives will become animated by the imagination of our Creator, by the dreams our Creator has for us. And that there is a word, when you hear about the lies, when you see all of the deception that was the nature of our childhood and actually is the nature of our wound, there will always be the one word, capital W, to which to return that has remained incorruptible when perhaps everything else in this person's life has been corrupted by deceit. So on the trajectory of hope that we've talked about, remember that the survivor is going to be choosing survivor step by step by step by step. We're going to be assuming the burden of this past that we did not choose, that wounded us before we were even grown. In the process, we're going to be gaining self-esteem to see what we survived. And we're going to learn how to respect our own boundaries because we're going to realize we had them. And in that process, be able to see and respect others' boundaries better. Our relationships, as a result, will become more stable and deeper. It doesn't mean we won't have our wounds, but we will have our skills. And as we integrate our faith into our recovery, we will gain sustenance from God and be able to thrive in grace. So then we have one last session to go in the basic concepts, and that will be a kind of review of your best role, pulling off of the other 9 sessions. Thanks a bunch. Now you know by now that my website is teresagreen.org, and there are 2 books available to you to help in any way. And here's my email. You can send suggestions, requests, queries, ideas, criticisms, whatever you may like. But thanks a lot for your time. We're almost done.